Hey guys, today we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the RX 9070 XT at 1440p. While I have taken a look at this card in a few titles, I have yet to actually do a full proper 1440p review of the card. So I figured, right now we're kind of in between big PC releases. Let's go back, take a look at the RX 9070 XT, and see how it's aged just in its early life here, and how it's holding up at its really desirable and optimal resolution being 1440p. We're using the ASRock Steel Legend version of the card. It has 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 video memory, playing on the latest AMD drivers and pairing with a 9800X 3D, as well as 64 gigabytes of DDR5. And where possible, we will be coming in here and actually enabling FSR4. Some of these games, they don't have FSR4 built into just the game files. You have to come into Adrenaline software and enable that here. So I will be doing that for supported titles. I will not be using Optiscaler for this particular test. Let's hop in. All right, first up here we have Assassin's Creed Shadows. We're playing at borderless window. This game does not have a exclusive full screen option, so 1440p of course. And we're playing it native to start off here. So native using TAA for, I know it says upscaling, but at 100% resolution scale, native AA just uses TAA for its anti-aliasing, no upscaling happening here. So playing on the high settings, with the important setting here that really makes a visual difference is making sure that our diffuse everywhere setting is on, which does use a bit of ray tracing. And you can see coming in here, right away, game like this, really what you're looking for is above 60 FPS. And, the FPS will vary slightly depending on scene, but really there's not like a ton of super fast action or anything like that that you're going to be seeing in a title like this. In some scenes, like in more congested areas with a lot of NPCs, busy cities and towns like that, may be a bit more demanding, but generally, the fact that we're getting right about 80 is really reassuring here. This is definitely a solid place to be at. We'll see if getting into a little bit of combat here changes anything. Don't really expect it to do. This game, the combat is not like super fast paced, no major effects going on that are gonna tank your FPS or anything like that. But as you can see, even with a bit of combat here, FPS still holding strong, right about 80 or so. Definitely a really solid performance without the need for any upscaling here at 1440p. Really, the high settings here in this particular title, this is, in my opinion, where you kind of get the best bang for your buck. You can bump up settings, but they will have a pretty dramatic effect to your FPS without actually offering much in terms of visual improvement. So high settings here in Assassin's Creed Shadows is really where I prefer to be, and a good place to benchmark it. Our 1% lows are actually really solid, sitting right about 70, incredibly flat frame time graph, really solid performance across the board, using about 10 gigabytes of video memory and pulling 300 watts. So is pulling, pretty substantial amount of power for the GPU, but handling it totally great. No complaints whatsoever about this performance. Really solid here, even at native resolution. Now, this game is one of those titles that does support FSR4, albeit with, having to enable it within Adrenaline software, but FSR4 is definitely a nice model and can offer some visual improvements as well as an FPS boost, especially on the higher settings like quality here. So let's just see what this looks like if we just set our FSR4 over here to quality. And just to confirm there, you can see that FSR4 is enabled with the green check mark. And as far as the actual visuals here, as we begin counting, honestly, like I said, the really great thing, in my opinion, about having a machine learning technology like FSR4 for our upscaling solution here with the 9070 XT and supported games is not just that it can offer you a, improvement to your frame rate, but oftentimes when you use it at a quality setting, it can offer you some more frames and actually sometimes even result in a better picture because you're going for a more sophisticated form of anti-aliasing than just, standard default pretty much across the board. What pretty much every game uses is like the lightest weight form of anti-aliasing nowadays, just TAA. In fact, a lot of games just have TAA baked in. Like if you go into the options for a game and it doesn't have any options for anti-aliasing, you should look it up. It's likely just throwing on anti-aliasing by default because a lot of games just don't want you to see all those, jagged edges. They don't even want you to have the option to kind of have that ugly experience. But as you can see, this does net us pretty substantial improvement, going from about the 80s to around the 90s. But really, in my opinion, there's not really a great reason not to use this as a solution because we're getting that slight, it's not like life-changing or anything, the improvement that we're getting, but we are getting an improvement, and we're getting an improvement while also getting pretty much, you know, the same picture quality, and oftentimes in some situations probably even better. You know, some of these fine details, like if we come into full age like this, it's rendering all these sharp edges very well. TAA, basically what it does, the temporal solution, is kind of just more fuzzing those edges, and oftentimes, you know, if you're, you know, playing at a high enough resolution, it looks pretty decent as is, especially like 4K. You know, 4K is definitely, you know, TAA is totally fine for 4K, but 1440p is kind of that middle spot where most of the time you may not be able to tell a difference, but when you really look for it, you probably can. So all that to say, really no reason not to use FSR4, at least at the quality setting here. You know, you may think, oh, I'd rather just play at native resolution, but really, my opinion, you're getting a better, you know, quality picture here, and you know, you're also getting a slight improvement, not huge, but slight improvement to our performance. So yeah, Assassin's Creed Shadows is, you know, definitely a pretty game, in my opinion, the prettiest Assassin's Creed game. I know Assassin's Creed is a series that people don't always love, but you know, it is a game that is popular, and nice to see that, you know, it performs well, because this is not a easy to run game by any means. You know, even higher end cards definitely struggle pushing frames on this game, so it is nice to see that, you know, we are getting really solid FPS here at 1440p. All right, next up here we have Expedition 33. Now for Expedition 33 here, we're going to be playing on the high preset TSR using our native resolution or scaling. So this is just basically using TSR for our anti-aliasing technology. Unfortunately, this is one of those, you know, Unreal Engine games, so there actually is no support for FSR at all. So upscaling is either going to be needed to be handed off to TSR, or they do support XeSS. So for native resolution here, I'm just going to go for TSR for anti-aliasing and cranking our scaling all the way up to 100 or epic. So this is native TSR on high settings. And we're in this this camp area. This is kind of like our little loading screen, basically like our debrief room. So not a demanding area whatsoever, but you can see, you know, this game, there's a lot of different environments that we'll be going through in this game. There's an overworld, there's like more defined areas where you'll run into enemies, camp areas like this, as well as combat encounters. So just going to show a few of them here to kind of get a sense of what we can do here on high settings. This is a game that does require timing for, you know, some of the combat encounters, so it is important that you're getting high FPS. So that is something that we do want to keep in mind. At least here in the camp area, getting around 100. Game looks, of course, really great here at native resolution. No issue whatsoever. All right, this next area here, this is kind of like this little overworld type map that you kind of traverse in, and you can see that, you know, we are getting a slight dip to our FPS. Not super significant or meaningful, but going from around, you know, 100 to around 80, still totally playable here at native resolution. You can see we're pulling 300 watts using 10 gigabytes of video memory. Totally acceptable performance here. Feels incredibly smooth, fluid, good frame times, no issue whatsoever. But let's see how this kind of holds up as we jump into a bit of combat. So in a bit of combat here, as you can see, and we are still getting really solid FPS right around 70 or 60, you know, more than enough to pretty much, you know, effectively do pretty much anything we need to do. I did miss some parries. That is definitely not necessarily the fault of our FPS here, but definitely, you know, pretty solid here. The game looks great at high settings, no issue whatsoever. You're able to pretty much time whatever that, you know, you'd want to time here. Definitely not seeing any problem with playing at this FPS. Really solid performance, despite the fact that unfortunately we do not have the same kind of support as far as our upscaling goes. But honestly, I don't really see a major need for it. We're getting solid performance. I am able to, you know, perform just as well as I would have otherwise. And thankfully, despite the fact that we are playing an Unreal Engine 5 game, we are still getting pretty solid 1% lows, you know, all things considered. Right around 60 for our 1% lows feels like a pretty smooth experience. And next up here, we have Counter-Strike 2 playing at full screen, 1440p. We're going to be playing on the low settings to begin with. I get a lot of requests to test games here on low settings. Now, the low preset does put on FSR to balance. We're actually going to turn this off just to get a look at what our native performance will be. So this is low settings at native 1440p. Now, some of these tests on like competitive like titles, you know, oftentimes they are more of a test of the actual CPU rather than GPU performance, but you know, you definitely need a GPU that's able to generate that many frames to push through our CPU. So it's kind of, you know, test both things in a way, especially here at low settings. So as you can see, you know, complete absurd ultra competitive FPS of about 600 or so on our average here. Definitely, you know, more than someone like me would need. I am not someone who mains Counter-Strike 2. I'm actually not very good at the game in general, but it is still, you know, obviously a very, very popular game here on Steam, and maybe even the most popular game on Steam, either this or Dota. And, you know, you do want a GPU that can definitely push the frames that you need, however competitive you want to be with it. But just keep in mind when we're doing these tests that, you know, there will be definitely an important factor when it comes to your CPU pairing. So having a 9800X3D, which is essentially top of the line CPU, maybe the 9950X3D is slightly faster in certain titles. I'm actually not sure if this is one of those games that the 9950 would outperform the 9800X3D. It seems like some games the 9800X3D has a slight advantage, and I'm not sure if this is really one of them, but start off around 600, drops just ever so slightly down to 570. Still, you know, incredibly strong performance here, and really, you know, no complaints whatsoever. This is definitely more than enough for someone like me, and I imagine for 99% of people, you know, you may not even have a monitor that really supports this high of, refresh rate. So, 500, 600 FPS, definitely, you know, incredibly strong performance. And now bumping up to our high settings here. So still playing 1440p full screen, just now on the high settings. Still nets you, you know, incredibly strong performance here. Slight dip in our FPS, coming down from like the high 500s or 600 down to right around 400. Still, in my opinion, you know, very, very competitive, like FPS, definitely still way more than I would ever need, but, still really rock solid performance. Really, really no surprise here. You know, Counter-Strike 2 in nearly any GPU benchmark is going to be pretty much a layup. Pretty much any GPU, including a lot of integrated graphics, can, give you playable and acceptable frame rates in this title. And the 9070 XT being, you know, like a $700 GPU, oftentimes $600 to $700 is no surprise that it's able to give us really, really solid performance here. All right, next up we have Cyberpunk 2077, and this game actually did just recently receive an update. And apparently FSR 4 support is coming, and I checked out, I reinstalled drivers and went with the optional preview driver just to see if we can get FSR 4 supported. Unfortunately, it does not look like it's actually supported quite yet. There seems to be some workarounds online that I'm not going to mess with too much. So just keep in mind that in the very near future, FSR 4 will be available for Cyberpunk 2077, which is amazing and really great. I believe the update that came out recently for the actual game offers some more improvements as far as frame generation, some more options, especially pairing with older series RTX cards and older series AMD cards. However, for now, we're just going to be sticking with this updated driver, 25.6.3. However, it does not support FSR 4. Playing here at 1440p full screen, and we're going to start off on Ultra here at native resolution. This just uses TAA for anti-aliasing. Otherwise, completely native picture, just turning off motion blur. That's mostly just personal preference. And you can see running around here just how strong the FPS here is here. Now, this is ultra settings without ray tracing. And, you know, daytime scenes like this, ray tracing doesn't really make a major impact anyways. So you're not really missing out on much, especially in this particular scene. I will say the TAA here, I wish we had FSR 4. Like, that's one of the reasons I actually did go in and check out to see if that was an option. The most demanding thing that you can do in this game is really just kind of driving around. So as we begin driving around a little bit here, you can see our FPS does dip a little bit, still getting right about 100 FPS or so. The game looks phenomenal. I mean, this is an interesting game. There's a ton of settings that are worth checking out in this particular game. But while the game does look really great with ray tracing, it does not look bad without ray tracing. As you can see, I mean, game looks absolutely phenomenal, and we're getting a native 100 plus FPS experience, 1% lows at 77. So, it's really just personal preference. Would you rather get, more native, super fluid type experience without the ray tracing, or, would you rather have the ray tracing on? My opinion, on a card like this, I wouldn't say this is a low-end card by any means, but it is a card that if we were to crank every setting, especially, if we're to go into path tracing or something like that, it would cause some pretty severe performance penalties. So, in my opinion, I'd rather get that performance at a less upscaled, more native picture like this, and just go without the ray tracing. But this is definitely one of those games that there's a ton of settings, there's a ton of support, and I'm happy to see that the support is continuing to be expanded upon with FSR 4 being enabled shortly. I might do a dedicated video on the FSR 4 support, although I have seen that some press have actually gotten access to that ahead of time, so there's might already be a ton of videos about that. But as you can see, game looks great, it's running super great. Here are ultra settings, native resolution, really no need for any of that upscaling, which is good because all we really have is FSR 2.1, I think, and 3.0. So not the best solutions when it comes to that upscaling, around 115 on our average here at ultra native. Now, of course, Cyberpunk is a game that is certainly, one of the showcases for ray tracing. So let's see if we're just go to ray tracing ultra. Let's see if this is even really something that is a playable state at 1440p here. So ray tracing ultra at native using the built-in. This is one of those games that doesn't give you options for anti-aliasing. That's tied to the resolution scaling when we talk about FSR, but it does use TAA when resolution scaling is set to off here. So RT Ultra here at native resolution, and unfortunately it does look like this does drop us pretty significantly into sub 60 FPS territory. So like I said, during the day, it still does use ray tracing, but it's not quite as noticeable. So looking at this, in my opinion, this is certainly not worth the performance hit. Where we were getting around like 100 plus FPS, now coming all the way down to 50. Definitely not a great experience here. And the other thing to keep in mind is that we don't really have great options when it comes to our upscaling without FSR 4. Now that should be changing soon, but at least as it is now, not the best of options. Even on foot here, a bit of combat, right around 50 FPS. It's not terrible. I mean, it's not unplayable by any means, but in my opinion, it's just not really worth it when it comes to the ray tracing performance hit. Much more likely what you would probably do is use a bit of FSR. I actually think 2.1 looks better than 3.0, so we'll stick with that. So let's just go with FSR at quality here. Still ray tracing ultra. And this does now get us into a space where we are reclaiming a lot of that lost FPS. And honestly, the FSR is doing a good enough job here. You're not really going to notice, the FSR issues here at, typically, like just playing the game, you're not really going to notice a major impact to your performance here as far as like the visual quality goes. It's really when you kind of come into like more fine details, like if you come up to, things like grass, foliage, maybe super fine lines, like maybe this barbed wire is a little bit flickery, not too terrible though. So FSR does kind of get you a good bit of the way there, and certainly once FSR 4 is fully properly supported in game, I do think that this will be a much more viable option. But for me personally, I'm just the type of person that I would prefer to go for, a non-ray tracing option and get the performance in a more natural, like native way. And then if we did apply FSR 4, maybe just throw on like quality and get even higher FPS. But things do look good. Like if we come up to like some windows, like these reflections, like there is some pretty dramatic improvements to lighting, reflections, shadows, things like that. It's just not really going to be 100% worth it all the time, in my personal opinion. You can see, driving around here, it does now drop us into the 80s. So even with it, a bit of FSR, it's still worse than native with ultra without the ray tracing. So, in general, pretty happy with the performance here. I think Cyberpunk, it's funny, I say it all the time, but it's definitely one of those games that over time, it looks better and better with the addition of, ray tracing updates, as well as it's become more well optimized over time too. So, and of course hardware is caught up to what the game was trying to do in the first place. So it is definitely a great game, and I do think, if you're someone who hasn't played Cyberpunk and you have a newer GPU, there's a lot of options and a lot of support for you to basically get whatever kind of performance that you want out of any given modern card. So definitely pretty happy with the performance here overall. Next up here, we have Doom: The Dark Ages. So for Doom here, let's just go for full screen, 1440p of course, TAA for our upscaler, but playing at 100% resolution scale. Resolution scaling turned off, so this is native resolution, and we're at Ultra Nightmare. Texture pool size slid all the way up, so these are max settings aside from the path tracing. So this is definitely a game, in my opinion, that you want to be playing at high FPS, and although it's not a competitive title, it's just a single player FPS game, it is a game that I do think really benefits from having high FPS just because the action is so fast. So I'd like to be around 120 FPS. This particular run that we are going on here is one I've done countless times. I've actually done an in-depth test on this card. So if you're curious about the particular performance on this game, there's a lot of more settings tested in that video if you want to check that out. In this particular run, this area in particular is the most demanding, kind of this hall with a bunch of enemies. You can see that we did dip down briefly there into the 90s, still holding strong, and game looks great, runs great. It's a well-performing game. It does not support FSR 4, unfortunately, but really there's not a huge need for upscaling, at least to begin with here. This is a game that was heavily marketed with NVIDIA, so it's part of the reason that it does not have FSR 4 support, as well as the fact that primarily it is a Vulkan title, so Vulkan games do not have FSR 4 support. FSR 4, as far as I know, is not supported in really any way, shape, or form on the Vulkan graphics API. But that's really irrelevant because, as you can see, we're getting essentially perfect performance, 100 FPS. Can't really ask for much more playing it native here. Game looks great, it's running great. The thing I love about this game is not only how high the FPS is, even at higher settings, but really the great thing is just the frame time graph and how smoothly and consistently the frames are being delivered. So not only is it a high FPS, it's a pretty consistently high FPS. 1% low down to 83. The frame time graph itself, as you look at it, it's basically just a flat line. Very, very little in this game actually causes that line to kind of spike or do anything out of the, out of the ordinary. You can see even like a bunch of like combat effects, stuff like that. It's still holding rock solid. So incredibly great experience here using the 9070 XT here, 1440p. It's absolutely a perfect pairing. Performance is just about exactly where I'd want it to be at. Game looks great and performs incredibly well. And just for fun, real quick, let's go ahead and throw on path tracing. So in case you were curious why I didn't test path tracing to begin with, is because it just causes a super severe performance hit. And really, in my opinion, I've looked at a lot of different scenes and settings and done side-by-side videos and things like that on other GPUs. And really, my opinion, take it from a high FPS, like around 110 to 120, all the way down to 30 FPS with pretty minimal actual visual gain. Like, there's not really that much happening in terms of like it looking a ton better. I just don't think it's really worth it on NVIDIA or on cards other than NVIDIA cards where, you have hardware that's more specially designed for it. And even then, honestly, you're really not missing out on much. The actual visual, improvement is not that substantial. All right, next up here, we have Oblivion Remastered. We're starting off here at native high settings. This uses TAA for our anti-aliasing. And from my experience, this game has actually gone through, seems like a bit of work. And at least from when I remember testing it at launch, it seems to have actually improved a lot. And I do actually have a in-depth video on the 9070 XT and its performance in Oblivion Remastered. It's actually one of my better performing videos, strangely enough. But I guess not that surprising considering the 9070 XT was brand new and this game was really popular at the time. But it seems to actually be a bit better. You can see our frame time graph is actually like pretty solid, which is wasn't always the case here on Unreal Engine 5. TAA here at 1440p. You know, this game just has a lot of really fine details where some stuff like grass, foliage, stuff like that, it's just so small and fine that even TAA at native 1440p doesn't look great. But what does look great is our FPS. So above 100 FPS, really this game, in my opinion, you're just looking for at least a solid 60 FPS, and we are getting that. In fact, we're getting far above that, even our 1% lows all the way up in the 80s. So definitely a really solid performing pairing here, and the game looks great here on high settings. This is with our ray tracing set to software low, so enabling ray tracing. This is a game that, in my opinion, ray tracing doesn't make a world of difference, but it is definitely one of those options that you can kind of tweak if you're getting adequate performance. Like even me personally here, I'd really just look for 60 FPS. Like the extra 40 FPS or so is nice, but really, it's not really that important, but it is resulting in us not really dropping below 60 at any point. Really not even coming close to 60 in most situations, really sitting pretty comfortably around 100 FPS. So definitely really solid performance here at high settings. Now let's see what we can get into at ultra. So again, like I said, we're just using software low. We're gonna just go ahead and crank this over to ultra, keep it at software low, resolution scale is at 100. So this is just native TAA with ultra settings. And this does get us pretty close to that, like right around 60 FPS mark. It's pretty substantial actually performance hit going from high to ultra. My opinion, high in this game, and really a lot of games, in my opinion, high kind of seems to be the sweet spot when it comes to performance versus actual visuals. But you can push it to ultra here and still get above 60 FPS. You're just not quite as comfortably above 60 FPS. Our frame time graph, while it is not really experiencing any major spikes at the moment, though there's definitely a good chance those will come. It's not quite as flat and smooth and fluid as it was on high settings. So regardless, you can see around water here is where we kind of get some dips into the 50s. Kind of depending where we look, point our camera, there's like into like the lower 50s. So while it is, averaging above 60 FPS, and oftentimes you're seeing 70, maybe even 80 at times, it's going beneath 60 often enough, that I'd probably prefer going for the high preset, because in my opinion, not really a huge, improvement here. We are using quite a bit of video memory here, ultra settings around 12.5 gigabytes. Of course, we have 16, so it's not the issue here. That's not what's causing the decrease in performance, but yeah, solid performance, if not not necessarily worth it, in my opinion, to go from high to ultra in this particular instance. All right, next up here we have Fortnite. Just like Counter-Strike 2, I've been getting a lot of requests to just test these competitive titles on low settings. So that's what I'm doing here. 1440p full screen, and we're on DirectX 12 mode using TAA at native. So just ignore the performance. That's grayed out. That's not applicable here. And we are on the low preset, just custom, because that messes with our resolution scaling, which we want to be playing at native here. So native, TAA, low settings. All right, so dropping in here, we'll start counting once we land, but just like with Counter-Strike 2, oftentimes when you play these competitive games on low settings, it becomes a bit of a CPU benchmark, because so much of your performance is dependent on your CPU being able to basically keep up with the performance that your GPU is actually providing. You can also see our CPU utilization is awfully high right now. We'll see if that does kind of even out once we kind of land and start playing a little bit here. But obviously, it goes without saying, this is incredibly solid performance here, more than enough for essentially anyone. I mean, certainly me. This is definitely enough performance to be competitive in, although the thing with Fortnite is oftentimes there are some pretty subpar 1% lows. It's not really the case here. As you can see, we're still getting 170 1% lows. Doesn't feel bad whatsoever. Around 500 FPS most of the time, now averaging out around 450. But Fortnite is definitely one of those games that you can really come in here and tweak settings. There is also a bit of performance to be gained if we did want to use a bit of upscaling, but obviously for this test, just kind of focusing mostly on a native performance, just to kind of get a feel of the actual GPU itself rather than any sort of upscaling technologies. After a bit more time on the ground, our 1% lows are improving a bit here now in the 200s. Looks like we are averaging out right around 450 for our FPS average. Not fully utilizing our GPUs, you can see hovering around 90 to 80% utilization. See if we can find ourselves a bit of combat here. Not that, Fortnite really is going to be super demanding, even in a combat setting, but goes without saying, I mean, in my opinion, this is totally adequate for any sort of competitive player. You're able to pretty much perform, however you would want to be. As you can see, killed a guy with a victory crown, so must mean that I'm better than him, and he won last match, so that goes to show that, the GPU is not going to be what's holding you back by any means, of course. But really solid performance, of course, here on low settings. Not super surprising, but Fortnite, much like Counter-Strike, is really a game that can be played on a lot of different configurations, integrated graphics. There's tons of options to kind of play with. So, here at 1440p low native resolution, getting above 400 FPS definitely feels really, really solid. And 1% lows are pretty solid too, right around 200. That's more of a engine result as opposed to any sort of GPU performance. But in general, if you're looking for competitive type experience in Fortnite, 1440p, you're not going to have any issues whatsoever. All right, next up here and final game we're going to be testing is Marvel Rivals. So we're playing here at 1440p TAAU. The U is for upscaling, but we're at 100%, so it's just using TAA for anti-aliasing, and we're on low settings here. So these are ultra competitive settings. If I can get into the game here. Now, luckily here on low settings, Marvel Rivals is one of those games that kind of looks pretty decent regardless of the settings that you really apply. It is an Unreal Engine 5 game, so there are some odd stutters and things like that that could potentially be, corrected or at least minimized with, the option of kind of bumping down some settings. So low settings here are actually probably what I would go for, lower medium settings anyways. This game does also support ray tracing, which I would highly advise against for a, competitive multiplayer title introducing ray tracing. But as you can see, getting right around 180 FPS, 150 for our 1% low. So really solid performance here, really, competitive like performance in my opinion. Really not a ton of room to improve here. I think these are essentially, 300 FPS or something like that. Could be nice and could be achievable with the use of some upscaling, which we will actually take a look at because we do actually have FSR4 support in this title. But even at native rendering here, getting real solid frame time graph, real high FPS, around 180, definitely a really solid place to be at. So let's go ahead and let's just see what we can get maximum performance. So FSR set to ultra performance. We'll see how this looks and also see, exactly the type of FPS that we're getting. And as you can see, it does look considerably worse. I mean, ultra performance is definitely using a ton of upscaling, probably more than most people would want. But if you're just looking for highest possible FPS, this does get you all the way up to 300 FPS. So definitely, a viable option if you're just the type of person who just is looking for, maximum possible FPS. You don't really care about, the slight, or maybe even in this case, maybe a little bit more than slight visual, issues that come with some more aggressive forms of upscaling. But as you can see, getting 300 FPS average definitely feels really, really solid here, and definitely makes the 9070 XT feel like a good fit for some competitive 1440p gaming on Marvel Rivals here. So all in all, the 9070 XT, in my opinion, is still a really great option. Obviously, it hasn't been a ton of time since the card's released, so it's not necessarily an old card really by any stretch of the imagination. It's still the top tier AMD option for the current generation. And, in my opinion, if you're spending $600-700 on it, if you can get it kind of in that price range, it's still a great buy and really feels at home and in a great place at 1440p. Really no issues across the board, handled everything incredibly well. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.